With so many different perspectives on race in our country these days, what would it be like to take a look at the issue from both sides, from a white perspective and a black perspective? Well, I'm going to ask one person that question today, my friend Drew Dorsey. Drew grew up in a biracial home in a predominantly white area of the country. And I'm going to ask him his perspective on what's going on in our world today. This is Real with Reed, a safe, honest, constructive place to have conversations about faith. And episode 3 starts right now. Hey, Drew, thanks for coming on to the podcast today. And I'm excited to hear your story and have a real dialogue about what's happening. Drew and I have known each other for a number of years. Drew, why don't you quickly give everybody just a little background story of how we know each other, and then just a little bit of background story about you.
Yeah. No, thanks so much for having me, Reed. It's a pleasure to be here. I know Reed because Taylor and I, his son, I don't know, probably like age of 10 or something, 5th grade, played hoops together. And so through basketball, I was introduced to the Robinette family. And then just shy of high school, I think Taylor went to McDonough, I went to public school. And so our communication channel kind of ceased to exist. But a few years later, when I started dating my soon-to-be wife, she had went to Crossroads, obviously Reed Pastor, and I guess 3 or 4 years later, Reed was marrying me. So not marrying me, he was conducting the marriage.
Conducting the ceremony. Yeah, I think that. Right. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, that's how I know Reed and his family. And I guess as an informal introduction to who I am. So as Reed mentioned, my name's Drew. I grew up in Westminster. I'm 27. I have a wife and 2 awesome kids. Relevant to today's conversation, I'm biracial, so my mom's white and my dad's black. And I'm in the finance world and still a Carroll County resident, and I like sports.
That's right. We have that in common for sure. And so, Drew, let's pick up on that you were from a biracial family and you grew up in an area where we're from that's not extremely diverse. So how was that growing up? How did that shape your picture of you and even your faith journey a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's funny because, by the time I was probably in middle school, I just had a hard time of really understanding like where I actually belonged, because, I'm sure this isn't just in Westminster, but, Carroll County, as you mentioned, is not terribly diverse. And so I felt like often, I wasn't black enough to be, well with the all black kids. And, as far as with the white kids, I was the black kid that just wanted to act white and dress white and be white. And so, I would never articulate this at the time, but it really created kind of like an inner tension for, who am I? How do I want to act? Like, which hat do I want to wear today so I can fit in? And I kind of quickly, again, driven by insecurity, but I quickly developed the ability to kind of just fit in whatever scene I needed to. But it sounds like that's a cool trick. But again, when the underlying issue is insecurity, it's actually exhausting because you never feel like you're quite enough in either group. And I probably didn't fully appreciate that, or at least I couldn't articulate that until, here I am today as an adult that's kind of had some time to wrestle with it. And, you mentioned faith, and that's certainly played a role in that. And, who I am today, although it's not a solved puzzle in the sense that I don't have to try anymore, but I really tried my best to know that my identity and who I am or who I'm not isn't defined by anything other than who God says I am. And that's his chosen son that has a life that's covered by grace, and I can never mess that up. And so that's a very hard thing to live out day to day, but that's kind of the reminder I have to give myself. And it's still relevant. I mean, I work in finance and I'm in a very, very predominantly white environment. And so, there's even times where I feel insecurity going into maybe a meeting with the company, because across the table from me is 4 or 5 middle-aged white guys. And the assumption is, what kind of hoops do I have to jump through, or how much extra effort do I have to give just to show I deserve a seat at the table? So it's a lingering thing, but like I said, my faith certainly helps me try to stay solidified in the truth.
Yeah. And gosh, thanks for sharing that. I feel like that's holy ground that you let us in on. And I know that that your mom and dad, just because I know them a little bit, probably did a great job just of walking with you through that process. But so you have this unique vantage point, right? Of racial tension. And so as things have unfolded, I've said to a couple of people that the George Floyd killing felt like a pattern that you just couldn't imagine was being repeated.
Sure.
And in my lifetime anyway, I felt a little bit like, gosh, I feel like we should have made more progress than this. How has it felt like, as you've watched some of the racial tension in your lifetime? How has that felt from being somebody from a biracial family? What's the unique perspective that you viewed this whole thing unfolding?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously you have what we call systematic and more like structural issues with racism. And, I'm not a sociology professional, so I don't want to dive into
Me
that.
neither,
But
yeah.
just like the human side, and this is probably a byproduct of how most people see me, but I more often than not resonate with, I think, being Black. And I don't want that to come out wrong, because I absolutely appreciate and love my biracial identity. And you're correct that my parents did a great job in instilling that in me. But it's just, when people look at me, I think they see me as a Black guy. You know what I mean? And so very rarely do people come up to me and they say like, "Oh yeah, I would suspect you're mixed." It's, "No, I think you're Black." And so I guess knowing that, I've kind of just recognized that maybe I look full Black to people. And so when I think about all that's going on, the biggest thing that comes to mind is like how scary, or how crappy, if that's okay to use, is the fact that could be me, or my brother, or my own dad, who's a middle-aged Black guy like George Floyd is. And as far as the perspective from a mixed person, I don't know if I have one as far as assessing or being able to essentially like process the injustice. But I think where I have a unique perspective is being a voice in the hallway of reconciliation. So you have Blacks on one side, whites on the other. And again, I grew up in a home where I had literally that same environment, Black and white. And so it's, it might sound corny, but like it's not that I don't see color, but race was never a huge deal in my house, because we represented the two ones that are most fought over, challenged in America.
Right.
And so I look at my upbringing as, again, a potential platform to say, hey, I can't speak for all Black people, and I don't walk through all the shoes of every Black man. And hey, I don't speak for white America, and I haven't walked through every shoe of all white America. But I can say that I've grown up with both in a very tangible and intimate way. And so I've been able to be exposed to experience that only maybe a white perspective would have, conversely, a Black perspective. And I think that perspective is what allows me to say, here's point A, here's point C, let me be point B. If that makes sense.
It makes a ton of sense. And gosh, I appreciate when I heard from some of my Black friends, the idea that they still have to worry when they get pulled over. This guy might just have a chip on his shoulder. And I never have to worry about that, Drew. Yeah. And it's wrong that anybody has to worry about that. And I feel like that the church should be an opportunity to move the ball down the field, not, not, I'm going to keep with the football and that, not punt, and say that's somebody else's problem. So let me ask you this question. As you have over your adult life watched the church, where have you seen the church be helpful in terms of issues of race and justice? And where have you seen the church be not as helpful?
Yeah, that's again a good question. My only, I guess I'll preface my answer by saying I don't attend regularly every church in the country, and so I don't want to suggest that I'm sitting over here with my microscope and saying I watched a YouTube clip on what some pastor said. He didn't say it right. That dude isn't hitting it on the head. Yeah. So I'll preface my response with just I want people to understand my perspective is solely one, and I don't want to say it in a condemning way.
Understood.
So where I think the church is going well, you mentioned earlier. So I went to Bridgeway Community Church in Columbia from the time I was like 13 to call it 19, 20. Mm-hmm. And then when Brooke and I got married, we wanted to, have our own thing, and we started going to Mosaic Christian Church, mm-hmm. and Mosaic's in Elk Ridge. And something that I think I've seen the church do well, and I can say this because both Bridgeway and Mosaic have been intentional about this, is by putting people of color in positions of influence. And, someone could look at, for example, a lead singer for the worship team. When you are a church that serves 2,000-3,000 people or whatever in the Baltimore metro area, and you might have first-time guests that are determining whether or not they come back based on that experience, being in a role where everyone sees you and everyone can see what you do and what you don't do. Mm-hmm. That's important. And so when I see churches that allow not just Black people, but, Spanish or Asian or any other type of non-white skin color, I see that as a plus sign. I've been a beneficiary of that myself. At Mosaic, I was able to have a speaking role and a role on the finance team there where I felt like I was making a difference. Mm-hmm. Where I would say the church has gone wrong would just be, you said earlier, this idea of punting. I would say that's probably where churches go wrong. It's really, really easy to be passive. It's really, really easy to say that's a them issue. It's not our issue. Mm. It's really easy to plead ignorance and maybe say that, oh, well, that's just maybe one bad apple out of the 50,000. And because it's so low statistically, we shouldn't exert all this energy over that. And specific to the George Floyd issue, and I'm going to bring it back full circle, is
sure.
This might be unpopular, but I don't think that the race issue starts and stops with police, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I don't walk down the street and say, every police officer that I see is a bad guy. My brother-in-law is a cop and he's a great guy. I think that it's a human issue, and racism and ignorance doesn't start or stop or doesn't discriminate based on profession. Mm. And so it's in boardrooms, it's in schools, it's in churches probably around the world somewhere.
Of course.
Law enforcement. And so the church is in a unique position where, like my church, everyone that goes there has usually some different type of representation, racially, socioeconomically, mm-hmm. professionally. And so what that does, it allows the church to become literally a mosaic, no pun intended, but literally a mosaic for differences, mm-hmm. and allows us to peel off all the layers that society might like to label us and put on us and say, at the end of the day, we're all just the same broken people that are in need of a savior. And it's not that, we don't have too much different after all. Mm-hmm. So.
And gosh, that's well said, Drew. And I have this idea that, the church should be out in front of the culture on this issue. And we just admittedly haven't been. So again, as you said, some churches better than others. I'm not passing judgment. I'm just talking about us. Yep. We should be a lot farther than we are. but that's not something to focus on. That is what it is. And so here we are, we're going to do now. And so I feel like raising the awareness level of the importance of dialogue like this could be a starting point. Mike Palmer, and when we hired Mike Palmer from a predominantly Black church to come and be a campus pastor with us, part of the hope was that it would foster this kind of dialogue. So Mike and I are like, well, this is what we asked for, I guess,
Yeah.
So here we go. I remember you saying one time to me about walking in to Bridgeway, and you said, I'm a biracial couple, and it doesn't even flag it. Nobody even notices. Right. And what a cool thing that is in terms of the body of Christ. So, gosh, that's certainly my hope. What do you think the unique role? I'm not asking you to do my job. I'm the pastor, right? But what do you think the unique role the church could play if it decided to get messy in terms of this content? What do you think the role the church could play would be?
So I wrestle with this because I used to get frustrated going to churches in Westminster where I felt like I walked into the auditorium and I was one of 4 Black people out of 700. And I was like, this is really frustrating. And then I was gently reminded by somebody that to an extent, the church can only represent so many different people. For example, if you live in a 100% town that's white, you can't expect that half your population is going to be Black and Spanish.
Tough to be diverse. Yeah, right. Sure.
And I think as a minority sometimes, because you maybe have a little bit of a defense around you and you're a little more defensive, that's an easy thing to kind of pick apart. And so to answer your question, it depends. I mean, if you're a church in Columbia that's within 25 minutes of Baltimore, DC, Montgomery County, then what's your excuse? If you're a church in some part in the world where there's 99.9% white folk, I try really hard to go after that 0.01, but they're limited.
Yeah. And
so my answer is it depends, but I think the example that Jesus outlined is pretty straightforward. If you look at the Good Samaritan story, or even the Samaritan woman, and if you look at the historical context of Jews and Samaritans, they hated each other, probably to the same extent that maybe some of Black and white Americans, I would like to hope way back in the day, but probably still today, there could be some ignorance, hatred, and bigotry there. Jesus shattered that by being a Jew and just going head first, not only with a Samaritan, but a woman. And he had dialogue with her. And he didn't go up to her and say, let me tell you what I can fix about you, because those who don't know her story, she had a lot that could have been quote unquote fixed. And he went in and had a dialogue. And from there, I don't need to preach the story, but from there, progress had been made. Yeah. And so I would like to hope that if the church can kind of keep it simple, be intentional about the direction at which you travel and the people that you're targeting and the conversation that you're going to have intentionality there, and understand that your heart should be one of love and empathy. And so don't approach people that are different than you and think, I need to have this conversation so I can fix, or so that I can tell you why your perspective is really just one of a few small ones and that we're not all like that. Like, just go in open-hearted and open-minded and keep it simple. Hey, we both like sports. Like, let's hang out and develop a genuine relationship. Like, I think that's somewhat part of my issue with today, and just kind of this effort for reconciliation is like, the effort is absolutely needed, but the gospel in of itself is simple. Like, we are the ones that are overcomplicated. And so I don't mean to water down your question, because I know it's a very, very big issue, and it's not something that we can solve in 30 minutes. Yeah. But I just think, if you look at the model of Jesus, he was intentional. He went after people that didn't look like him, that were outcasts, that everyone else blew their mind over. And if we can just follow his approach and just just starting with going to them and being physically present, and prayerfully ask God to do the rest. I mean, I don't know if I would like to hope that is better than what we were doing today. I don't know.
Gosh, well said. You've probably heard somebody before say that people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, and Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. And it's about that simple. And I do agree with you, Drew, that the personal relational piece has more power than almost every other step. If Christ followers who were from different cultures, whether it's white and black or whatever it is, would have relationships, would make it personal. So many things figure themselves out within that context of, that's just my friend, and I'm not trying to change them into me, and or they trying to change me into them. But
I think the underlying, I think it has to be in boldness, though. Like we, myself included, love to go where it's comfortable.
Sure.
And so I can't sit there as a Christian and say I want to actively participate and then cross my hands and wait for if I'm a white person, a black guy that talks like me, dresses like me, we have the same profession, and we drive the same sports car.
Right.
Like it can't be that level of passivity. Like it needs to, again, intentionality and boldness, where for me as a mixed black and white guy, this isn't true, but maybe I have a problem with Asian Americans. Again, not true.
Yeah.
So then maybe I go to my Asian American neighbor that exists, and I simply say, hey, this is really weird, but I'd love to get a coffee and a donut and bring it to you, and we can just hang out on the front porch and talk and get to know each other. Really weird example, but you get my point. It's that level of intentionality and boldness that I think that is really required to be ambassadors of change.
And I completely agree with you that it's not in any way diminishing the broadest sense of the problem. It certainly needs to be hit head on. But what makes it, in my opinion, and I think this is what you're saying too, Drew, is that what makes more difference than anything else is the action of one person. Exactly. And the action of the next person, and then the action of the next person. So I see that in Jesus. It's funny that not funny. It's unique that he says he's completed his work at the end of 3 years, and he kind of poured into like 12 relationships and handed the thing off. And you might have thought, well, that didn't make much difference at all. Well, it changed the world. And so I do think that there's a power in that one person doing what they can do. And so I love what you said there. Hey,
and if I can add one quick thing, because it just came to mind. I would also say, Christians, be gracious to your fellow believers or friends making an honest attempt. Like, don't minimize or criticize that maybe my effort is only going up to my Starbucks barista and being genuine and nice and just telling them they matter, or maybe it's not even that forced or awkward. You just are overly nice and compassionate. Like, don't minimize or mock that effort, because as you were saying, Reed, like, we can't just all be bystanders and wait for Uncle Sam to bring down change, or our congressmen or congresswomen to be the only ones that bring change. Like, and so I see it a little bit on the social media, and there's just so much nitpicking and critiquing, and it's like, why don't you, instead of doing that, encourage them and promote their effort and just say, hey, that might not have seemed like a big deal, but that was one big step bigger than we were taking yesterday, and that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Celebrate that, right?
Yeah.
What gets celebrated gets repeated, and so I'm with you on that. Hey, we're running out of time, but I wanted to give you a chance on all these podcast episodes. I give my guests a chance to ask me anything, and so so fire away, whatever you got.
Yeah, this is so. assuming most of your listeners will know this, but Crossroads is Westminster, Hampstead, or Hampstead, Eldersburg. Yep. And let's just focus on Westminster, where you've had a presence there for what, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, exactly.
So I visited your church a few times, right? And it's predominantly white church. And so I'll just ask you very pointedly, what does Reed Robinette and team do to go after those in Westminster and surrounding neighborhoods that don't fit the current attendee profile that most of your church has?
Great question, Drew, and I'll answer it in two ways. And you already gave the first answer. When you put people of color or of a different culture, of some not the predominant attender profile, as you just said, when you put someone in a position of authority and of recognition, that goes farther than anything that you can ever say. That someone can walk in the building and look on stage and see someone that they think, I'm like them. So in hiring Mike Palmer as a Black pastor, we have hired Tito Matos as a Hispanic pastor. And so we are trying to diversify the leadership and the people that you see in leadership positions at Crossroads. As you said, Westminster's not the most diverse place in the world, but we want to model that to the extent that we can. The second thing I would say in answer to that, though, is that sometimes there are cultural barriers that we should not make people cross before they can meet Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Like, so we adopted this community center in Westminster on Sullivan Avenue. And we had this idea that it might be a small campus, but what we found was that the whole population surrounding in 4 or 5 blocks in any direction of this property is all Hispanic, mostly Central American, have moved here. Very few of the adults speak any English. The kids have learned because they're going to school. And so to ask them to come into our style of worship and even language barrier to meet Jesus seemed like a hurdle that's too high to ask someone to get over. So we wanted to make it very easy. There's that verse in Acts 15 that says, we should not make it difficult for those who are turning to God, right? And so what we did was started an after-school program and tutoring, and some of the parents work shift work, and so the kids didn't have any place to go when they got off the school bus. And the community center is actually the bus stop. So it didn't take a rocket scientist to think, hey, we should just open the door and let the kids come in. And so now we're running what's our elementary school ministry for kids after school in Spanish and in English. And then we're doing ESL classes, and then we're doing a food pantry, so that they don't have to choose between paying rent and feeding their families. And in all of that, there's been more ministry happening than we could have had 1 million church services the way we do it.
Right.
And they would not have gotten a picture of Jesus as clearly as they have just by being in their community and reducing the barriers for relationship to happen. So it's a small step. We're measuring progress in inches, not miles. Sure. But again, I think, who am I to assess the significance of one or two relationships there? I have no idea what the ripple effect is going to be in the kingdom of God.
Absolutely.
Going forward. So, I have shared with a lot of people that I have felt like a fish out of water in terms of I grew up in Westminster, so that might sound odd. But gosh, I I get all jazzed up when I'm around people with differences and different cultures, and so I'm pretty sure God still wants me here. And so while I'm still here, I'm going to try to make it as colorful as possible.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's not a small undertaking. So you got your hands full, and thanks for the honest answer.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you, Drew. I appreciate you coming on with me. And my prayer is that this conversation just helps somebody else to have an honest, real conversation. So thanks for being with me tonight.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. See you later.
Okay, man.
Now, if you thought this conversation was valuable, definitely subscribe, because there's more just like this one on the way. Around here, we think it's crucial to provide a safe and judgment-free place for people with different perspectives to come together and to learn from one another. Thanks for keeping it real with Reed. I'll see you soon.